It was 7:42 a.m. on November 12, 1960, when a thick frost blanketed the small town of Ashford, Pennsylvania. The sky was a cold, brittle gray, and the faint whistle of the morning wind cut across the empty streets. At the edge of town, the towering silhouette of the Ashford Coal Plant loomed like a silent sentinel, its brick walls stained with decades of soot and smoke. Inside, the machinery had already hummed to life, filling the air with a low, rhythmic drone. Workers, bundled in heavy coats and gloves, navigated the narrow catwalks and steel staircases, exchanging nods and quiet greetings, unaware that this day would carve itself into history. Among them was Henry Caldwell, a veteran foreman with a lean frame and a weathered face that spoke of 40 years spent beneath coal dust and boiler steam. Henry moved with a measured precision, inspecting the boilers and checking gauges with the care of a man who knew every creak and shiver of the plant. He had a reputation for reliability and quiet wisdom, someone the younger workers respected without question. His hands, thick and calloused, had shut down machines hundreds of times, yet something about the morning felt different. A subtle tension hung in the air, almost imperceptible, like the pause before a storm breaks, at precisely 8:03 a.m. As Henry adjusted the pressure valve on the main furnace, a distant, metallic clang echoed through the plant. Other workers paused mid-step, turning toward the sound, expecting an explanation or a supervisor's instruction, but none came. The clanging repeated, now louder and more insistent, yet no one could locate its source. Doors that had been open since dawn now slammed shut on their own, and the main control room's lights flickered and died, leaving the entire facility in a sudden, unsettling dimness. Phones went dead. Radios crackled with static, and for a moment the hum of machinery stilled entirely, as if the plant itself were holding its breath. Outside, townsfolk noticed the plant's gates were abruptly closed, heavy iron swinging to a precise, locked position. No one saw the workers leave. No one heard the footsteps of the employees retreating. When neighbors approached, hoping for an explanation, the main entrance was impenetrable and the windows dark, opaque with grime and shadow. The town's curiosity quickly shifted to unease. Whispers spread like wildfire, something extraordinary or something terrible had occurred, but no one could say what. Hours passed, then days. Weeks turned into months. The Ashford Coal Plant remained sealed, its secrets tucked behind iron and brick, leaving the town with nothing but questions and the uneasy knowledge that life inside had abruptly ceased. No one knew that decades later the very same plant would be discovered, fully intact, as though time had never touched it. Before the abrupt closure, the Ashford Coal Plant had been the heartbeat of the town, a place where routines wove into the rhythm of everyday life. Workers like Henry Caldwell and his colleague Maggie Rivers moved through their days with a sense of purpose that had become second nature. Maggie, a meticulous engineer in her late 20s, had a knack for noticing details others overlooked. Her curly auburn hair was often tucked beneath a worn hard hat, and her hands were perpetually smudged with coal dust. She arrived each morning with a thermos of coffee in hand and a ledger of notes, jotting down minute anomalies in the machinery with quiet precision. The plant was her world, as much as it was Henry's and countless others who relied on it for livelihood. The employees shared a camaraderie that extended beyond the factory floor. During breaks, they would gather in the small cafeteria, trading stories of family, local gossip, and past accidents narrowly avoided. Henry would recount tales of boilers that had rattled like thunderstorms in the night, or the time a conveyor belt had jammed under suspicious circumstances. Maggie, always analytical, would listen intently, scribbling observations in her notebook that often puzzled her colleagues. Life outside the plant mingled seamlessly with life within it. The local diners' pies, the children playing in the frosted streets, the weekly church choir, all threaded into the fabric of their daily existence. Yet amid this ordinary rhythm, subtle hints of unease lingered, often dismissed as fatigue or coincidence. In the weeks leading up to November 12th, a handful of small, almost imperceptible occurrences began to unsettle the regular order. Henry noticed gauges that fluctuated without cause, valves that squeaked with a strange insistence, and shadows that moved differently across the boil. Rooms in the early morning light. Maggie, poring over maintenance logs, found entries that didn't match the machinery's performance, cryptic notes left by an unknown hand. The workers themselves were subject to fleeting moments of tension, a glance too sharp from a foreman, a whispered warning from a night shift operator, who claimed he had seen sparks jump from machinery with no ignition source. No one could pinpoint a pattern, and yet collectively the staff felt the subtle shift in the plant's atmosphere, like a low hum vibrating beneath Our awareness, even the routines of the town intertwined with the plant's pulse. Market vendors would comment on the timing of the trains that delivered coal, noting minor irregularities with delivery schedules. Local families, many with fathers, sons, and brothers employed at Ashford, observed the workers' cautious glances as they emerged each evening, carrying an invisible weight that none could name. The town, so dependent on the plant for its economic survival, had come to regard these anomalies as small quirks in a familiar landscape. Daily life continued, yet beneath the surface of work and domesticity, an unspoken tension began to coil, unnoticed by most but palpable to those who spent their days navigating the labyrinth of steel, coal dust, and shadowed corridors. Through this ordinary veneer, the plant had been quietly revealing itself, layer by layer, to those who were most attentive. Maggie would linger after hours, listening to the faint creaks of the steel beams, the whisper of coal sliding through chutes, or the subtle hiss of pressure releasing in the darkness. Henry, walking alone down the main catwalk at dawn, would pause, feeling the vibration of the building under his feet, a heartbeat of metal that seemed to echo unspoken warnings. Life at the Ashford Coal Plant was ordinary and yet strangely alive, full of patterns and personalities that hinted at deeper currents. And in those currents, the first, almost invisible threads of a coming mystery had begun to weave themselves, setting the stage for an event that will leave the town and history itself suspended in a haunting silence. In the weeks before the plant's sudden shutdown, a series of unusual events began to unsettle those who had grown accustomed to its predictable hum. Henry Caldwell, ever vigilant, noticed subtle irregularities in the machinery that seemed almost intentional. Gauges would spike inexplicably, warning lights flickered despite no recorded malfunction, and the coal conveyors occasionally groaned and shuddered, as if resisting an unseen force. At first, Henry attributed these anomalies to wear and tear, the natural toll of decades of constant operation. Yet the frequency and precision of these disturbances suggested something more deliberate, something hidden just beneath the surface of everyday operations. Maggie Rivers, with her meticulous notes and sharp eye, began to record details others overlooked. She observed small yet strange behaviors from her colleagues, furtive glances exchanged in the control room, hushed conversations that abruptly ended. Hen's supervisors approached, and employees who seemed nervous around certain machinery. One afternoon, she overheard a brief, cryptic remark from the night shift foreman, Walter Jensen, who muttered about keeping it quiet until the right time. When she asked him to clarify, he quickly changed the subject, leaving Maggie with a lingering sense of unease. These moments, minor in isolation, accumulated like a warning that something unseen was unfolding within the plant. Locals too began to notice subtle, disquieting signs. Deliveries of coal were occasionally delayed or rerouted without explanation, and the sound of trains approaching the plant carried a strange, hollow echo that unsettled the town. The plant's chimneys, usually alive with the roar of smoke and fire, emitted lighter plumes or none at all during certain shifts. Children playing near the perimeter fences would sometimes point toward the plant, insisting they had seen shadows move in impossible ways. Rumors began to swirl among the townspeople, talk of secret inspections, whispered about strange cargo being loaded in the dead of night, and speculati On that the plant's management was hiding something significant from both the workers and the community. Even the personal lives of the employees began to reflect the tension within the plant. Henry confided in his wife Mary about the growing unease, describing the mechanical anomalies and cryptic exchanges he witnessed. She noticed a change in him, an almost compulsive attention to detail, sleepless nights and moments of quiet muttering that hinted at worries he could not fully express. Maggie, too, felt the weight of her discoveries pressing against the confines of propriety and fear. Her notebooks grew filled with questions she dared not voice aloud, lines and arrows connecting observations that, taken together, suggested a puzzle far larger than any single worker could solve. As the days passed, the cumulative effect of these warning signs began to dominate the atmosphere within the plant. Machinery that had once operated predictably now seemed alive with subtle rebellion, each malfunction carrying the tension of an unsolved mystery. Conversations became measured, steps more cautious and eyes more vigilant. Henry would pause at the top of the main stairwell, listening to the creak of steel beams and feel a cold ripple of uncertainty, a sensation that the plant itself was watching, that it knew more than any of them could comprehend. Maggie's meticulous charts and logs filled with observations of irregularities became her silent companion, a map of the unease spreading like an invisible web across the plant's labyrinthine corridors. No one could articulate what was coming, and yet the warning signs were unmistakable to those attuned to them. Shadows stretched in odd directions, machinery spoke in unexplainable clicks and hisses, and the air carried a weight heavier than coal dust alone. In the hearts of Henry, Maggie, and a few others, a quiet fear began to take root, a sense that the Ashford Coal Plant was harboring a secret, one that would soon force its way into the world in the most shocking and unforgettable manner. The ordinary rhythms of work and life had been replaced by a growing tension, a suspense that only those who truly listened could perceive, and that tension was about to reach its climax in a way no one could have anticipated. It was 8:03 a.m. On that fateful November morning when the Ashford Coal Plant reached a moment that would linger in the town's memory for decades. A thin layer of frost still clung to the steel railings outside, and the morning light cast long, pale shadows across the brick facade. Inside, Henry Caldwell was on his usual inspection route, checking the pressure gauges in the boiler room with careful, practiced hands. The rhythmic clanking of machinery was a familiar comfort, until it was. A sudden, sharp clang echoed through the cavernous halls, unlike any sound the plant had ever made. It resonated from deep within the heart of the facility, reverberating off steel and concrete, setting workers' nerves taut. Maggie Rivers in the control room paused mid-note, her pencil hovering over the ledger. The lights flickered once, then twice, and a low hum of static replaced the steady rhythm of the electrical systems. The radio crackled with incoherent bursts, and the phones went dead simultaneously. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the metal gates as though warning the town of the chaos within. Workers stopped where they were, glancing around in confusion, trying to make sense of the sudden, unexplainable silence. Tools clattered to the floor, boots echoed on steel stairs, and the usual symphony of the plant, the roar of furnaces, the whistle of steam valves, the shuffling of labor fell abruptly mute. Henry reached for the main control panel, only to find it unresponsive, the gauges frozen at odd, impossible readings. Panic stirred among the employees, but it was contained, hesitant, because the air itself seemed thick with a strange, stifling presence. Some tried the exits, only to find the gates locked as if by a mechanism no one could control. Windows refused to open. Hallways that had always been familiar now twisted in shadows and dim light, disorienting even the most experienced workers. Henry called out for Maggie, his voice echoing eerily through the empty chambers, but there was no reply. Footsteps that should have answered him seemed swallowed by the building. In the boiler room, a young apprentice, Samuel Dyer, froze as the conveyor belt stilled mid-motion, coal spilling silently onto the steel floor. He instinctively reached for a nearby switch, but nothing responded. The machinery, once alive and singing with fire and power, now seemed inert, almost conscious in its stillness. Outside, townspeople who had ventured near the perimeter fences witnessed something inexplicable. The gates had swung closed on their own, and the plant appeared sealed, untouched by human hands. When they knocked, no one answered. When they called for help, only an unsettling silence returned. By noon, the reality had set in. The plant was sealed. Every worker who had been inside that morning, including Henry, Maggie, and Samuel, had vanished. No footprints, no echoes of a struggle, no indication that anyone had left the building at all. The machinery sat frozen in place, as if time itself had stopped inside those brick walls. A thick, unnatural quiet enveloped the plant, pressing down on the surrounding town like a heavy fog. In the days that followed, authorities attempted to force entry, but the gates held fast, and the windows remained opaque with soot and shadow. The Ashford Coal Plant had transformed from a bustling industrial heart into a frozen monument of mystery. Everyone thought it was an accident, a malfunction, or a tragic lapse in procedure. But the absence of explanation, the precision with which the plant had sealed itself, and the total vanishing of the workers hinted at something far stranger. The moment of disappearance was not just a shutdown of machinery, it was a halt of life itself, a question left suspended in air, unanswered and unapproachable. And in that frozen instant, the stage was set for a secret that would not reveal itself for decades, waiting silently behind brick and steel as if the plant itself were guarding a truth no one yet dared to uncover. As news of the Ashford Coal Plant's sudden sealing spread, a wave of confusion and urgency swept through the town. Local authorities led by Sheriff Thomas Granger arrived within hours, clipboard in hand, and a sense of duty that masked their growing disbelief. Teams of officers, technicians, and engineers gathered at the perimeter, examining the massive iron gates that had swung shut with uncanny precision. They tried every method known to them, pry bars, cutting torches, even rudimentary explosives, yet the gates held as though fused by some invisible foe. Inside, the silence was impenetrable, a tangible weight pressing against the steel walls, daring anyone to breach it. Families of the missing workers, including Henry Caldwell's wife Mary and Maggie Rivers' younger brother Jonathan, descended upon the plant, desperate. For news, their faces, etched with fear and confusion, mirrored the growing despair of the town. Mary pleaded with the officers, her voice quivering, recounting Henry's meticulous habits, his unwavering attention to detail, insisting that he would never disappear willingly. Jonathan clutched Maggie's worn notebook, hoping for clues hidden in the scribbled observations that might explain her absence. The local community, tightly knit and dependent on the plant's operations, felt the sudden vacuum of anxiety ripple through every home, every street. Rumors swirled. Some claimed the plant had been sabotaged, others whispered of secret experiments or a disaster covered up by higher authorities. Each theory, more dramatic than the last, gained traction among the anxious populace. Inside the plant, authorities faced an eerie tableau. Conveyor belts frozen mid-motion, tools scattered across the floor as if dropped in haste, and machinery perfectly intact yet entirely inert created a surreal scene. Engineers documented every detail, taking notes and photographs, yet each observation deepened the mystery rather than solving it. It was as though the plant existed in a separate dimension, one where the normal rules of operation and human presence no longer applied. Every attempt to force entry ended in frustration, and with each passing hour the sense of impossibility grew stronger. The building was no longer merely a workplace, it had become a sealed monument of absence, a puzzle that mocked the collective intelligence of those trying to understand it. Sheriff Granger coordinated a systematic investigation, organizing teams to inspect the surrounding grounds, nearby rail lines, and the town's archive. As for any pattern that could explain the phenomenon, volunteers combed the forests and fields, calling out names, shining flashlights into the early winter dusk, hoping for a sign, a footprint, a discarded deglove anything that might hint at what had transpired. Weeks passed, yet the search yielded nothing. The plant remained sealed, and its occupants, Henry, Maggie, Samuel, and the rest, were nowhere to be found. The local newspaper ran daily bulletins, the headlines growing increasingly desperate, chronicling the strange and unprecedented event that gripped Ashford. Amid the growing tension, the families and investigators tried to piece together what could have occurred. They pored over the plant's schematics, interrogated former night shift supervisors, and reviewed delivery logs. Yet every trail seemed to loop back on itself, creating a labyrinth of questions with no exit. The psychological toll began to manifest visibly. Insomnia, anxiety, and a creeping sense of hopelessness shadowed those who had once walked confident. Lie through the plant's halls. Even Henry's wife, Mary, found herself waking to imagined sounds of the plant's machinery, convinced she could hear her husband's familiar voice carry. On the winter wind, the initial search efforts, though thorough and fueled by desperation, only underscored the impossibility of the situation. The Ashford Coal Plant had transformed from a center of productivity into an enigmatic void, a challenge to logic, reason, and human understanding. And as the days turned into weeks, the town realized that whatever had occurred that morning was not a simple accident, not a routine mechanical failure, but an event that defied comprehension, a moment frozen in time, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a haunting sense of absence. That would not easily fade. Weeks slipped into months, and the initial urgency that had gripped Ashford began to give way to a slow, gnawing frustration. The investigators, despite their best efforts, found themselves trapped in a cycle of dead ends. Every attempt to force entry into the Ashford Coal Plant had failed. The iron gates remained immovable, the machinery untouched, and the workers' absence as complete as the silence that now defined the facility. Sheriff Thomas Granger, once brimming with determination, began pacing the perimeter with a heavier step, his notes growing more scattered, his eyes haunted by the impossible. The town, too, started to feel the weight of stagnation, the once bustling streets tinged with a collective sense of despair. Families clung to hope, yet the months offered no solace. Mary Caldwell would stand by the frosted windows of her home, staring toward the plant, imagining Henry walking the catwalks, checking gauges, unaware of the weeks slipping by. Jonathan Rivers, now tasked with helping search for his missing sister, Maggie, combed through her meticulously kept notebooks, searching for some clue that might explain her disappearance. Every scribbled observation seemed more like a riddle than a guide, and with each day, the hope that something concrete would emerge began to fray. The town's residents whispered to one another, trading theories that ranged from plausible accidents to fantastical conspiracies, yet none satisfied growing unease that gripped them all. Within the investigation teams, frustration seeped into every conversation. Engineers debated over schematics, trying to imagine a mechanical failure so precise it could seal an entire plant and erase all trace of its occupant. Local authorities questioned the contractors and delivery crews, revisiting every record of coal shipments, maintenance logs, and shift rotations. Each line of inquiry returned with more questions than answers. Even the smallest clues, an unrecorded delivery, a misaligned valve, a forgotten memo, dissolved under scrutiny, leaving the investigators feeling as if the plant itself were erasing history, protecting the secrets it had swallowed. Psychologically, the stalemate weighed heavily. Sheriff Granger began losing sleep, haunted by visions of the plant frozen in its eerie silence. His deputies grew irritable and despondent, often snapping at one another over minor disagreements, the stress manifesting as tension and fatigue. Mary Caldwell, whose hope had been a lifeline, started to experience vivid dreams of Henry trapped inside the plant, wandering the catwalks endlessly. Jonathan Rivers would awake in the middle of the night, convinced he had heard Maggie calling from the distance, only to find the house still, empty and quiet. These psychological strains mirrored the physical barriers imposed by the plant. The deeper the frustration grew, the more impenetrable the mystery seemed. Amid outside, the town's pulse began to slow. Shops once busy with morning trade saw fewer customers. People avoided the streets near the plant, fearful of the stillness and secrecy that emanated from the massive brick structure. Even the local newspaper, once a voice of daily updates and speculation, could offer only repetition. The plant remained sealed, the workers gone, the answers nowhere to be found. Weeks of searching, investigation, and hypothesizing had led to nothing but a collective exhaustion that hung over the community like the thick winter fog. The dead ends forced the authorities to pause, to reconsider strategy, and to accept the grim possibility that they might never penetrate the mystery. They shifted focus, documenting what they could from a distance, taking photographs and preserving records in the hope that a future discovery might provide the breakthrough they desperately sought. Yet even in this enforced patience, a persistent unease lingered. The plant stood silent and unyielding, a monument to absence, and each passing day only deepened the sense of helplessness. The community, the families, and the investigators were left with an oppressive awareness. The Ashford Coal Plant had become a sealed time capsule of uncertainty, a puzzle without a solution, and a reminder that some mysteries refuse to be tamed, no matter how determined the search. Decades passed, and the Ashford Coal Plant remained a sealed relic, a ghostly monument to a morning frozen in time. Generations grew up hearing whispers about the vanished workers, and the plant itself became the subject of local legend, a cautionary tale shared in hushed tones. Then, in the summer of 1998, a breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. Samuel Dyer, now retired and living on the outskirts of town, was clearing out a forgotten storage shed behind his property. Among dusty crates and rusting tools, he uncovered an old, leather-bound ledger with the Ashford Coal Plant insignia embossed on its cover. At first glance, it seemed like a routine archive, yet a closer inspection revealed that the ledger had been locked with a rusted clasp and carefully preserved. Opening it, Samuel discovered a meticulous record of machinery maintenance, employee schedules, and internal memos that had never been filed with the town's authorities. Most curious of all were the annotations in the margins, written in a sharp, almost clinical hand. Names were listed alongside unusual codes and cryptic remarks. Shift X, do not disturb, seal completed, await instructions, check valves 3, 7, and 12, compliance verified. Samuel, familiar with the plant's history, immediately recognized that these notes did not align with standard operational procedures. It suggested that someone within the plant's management had deliberately orchestrated the sealing, recording it in painstaking detail for reasons that remained obscure. Word of the ledger reached Jonathan Rivers, Maggie's brother, who had never stopped searching for clues. Together, he and Samuel pored over the entries, mapping out every anomaly noted in the decades-old document. Each page offered a tantalizing fragment of insight, the exact sequence of events leading up to the shutdown, mentions of machinery that had never functioned before, and directives that seemed almost secretive, as if the plant had been part of an experiment or hidden program. One line, written in the margin near the date November 12, 1960, simply read, "All personnel accounted for, proceed with containment protocol." The word struck Jonathan with a mixture of dread and curiosity. Containment protocol, what could that possibly mean? As investigators were contacted to review this discovery, the ledger became a pivot point for renewed scrutiny. Historians, engineers, and former employees examined its contents, noting that certain pages were carefully crossed out, while others were annotated W. It symbols that suggested a code or system, still undeciphered. The ledger also referenced storage rooms and sections of the plant previously undocumented, hinting at hidden chambers, equipment, or archives sealed away from prying eyes. For the first time in decades, the mystery shifted from being about absence to being about deliberate preservation. The plant had not simply frozen in time, it had been preserved intentionally with care, precision, and secrecy. The revelation sent shockwaves through Ashford. Families who had mourned or accepted the disappearances now faced a new, perplexing reality. The plant itself held answers, yet remained inaccessible. Samuel and Jonathan, driven by a mix of hope and apprehension, led a small team of local historians and engineers to re-examine the perimeter, matching the ledger's references to physical locations within the plant. The anticipation was palpable, each step toward the gates, each cross-reference with the ledger building tension. Something significant had been documented, something that contradicted every prior theory of accident, negligence, or tragedy. The plant's mystery was not random. It was orchestrated, and the ledger provided the first tangible evidence of intent behind the decades-long silence. With the ledger in hand, the narrative of the Ashford Coal Plant shifted dramatically. The decades of frustration, dead ends, and unanswered questions suddenly had a new dimension, a deliberate plan, a hidden agenda, a human hand guiding what had been long assumed to be an inexplicable phenomenon. The town, the families, and the historians felt a flicker of hope, tinged with fear, realizing that what lay beyond the gates was not merely a lost scent but a preserved truth, waiting patiently to reveal itself in the stark light of discovery. The day they finally managed to breach the perimeter of the Ashford Coal Plant was overcast, the sky heavy with gray clouds that threatened rain. Samuel Dyer, Jonathan Rivers, and a team of engineers and historians approached the gates with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The tools they carried, torches, hydraulic presses, and pry bars, seemed almost insignificant against the immensity of the iron barriers that had kept the plant sealed for nearly 4 decades. Yet as the first beam of light fell across the gates, an inexplicable calm settled over the group, as if the building itself acknowledged that its secret was finally about to be revealed. Inside, the plant was both familiar and alien. Dust lay thick over every surface, the air smelled of coal and rust, but the machinery gleamed with a strange, preserved luster as though someone had frozen the entire operation mid-shift. Conveyor belts were intact, valves and levers remained poised, and tools were neatly arranged, their positions unaltered since that fateful morning. Samuel led the way, guided by the ledger he had discovered, matching each cryptic annotation to actual machinery, rooms, and corridors. It became evident almost immediately that the plant had been maintained in a state of intentional stasis. This was no accident of neglect, it was a deliberate preservation. In the central control room, Jonathan discovered a hidden panel, previously obscured by layers of dust and cobwebs. With a tentative hand, he pressed a concealed latch, revealing a small compartment containing personal items of the missing workers, a hard hat with G's initials etched inside, Henry's tools carefully bundled, and a faded photograph of the night shift team. The items were untouched, frozen in a moment of life suspended. It was chilling and profoundly intimate, a human imprint left behind that contrasted sharply with the mechanical perfection of the plant. Each artifact was a testament to presence, yet each confirmed absence, creating a tension that gripped everyone in the room. Moving deeper into the plant, the team discovered chambers referenced in the ledger, rooms that had never appeared on blueprints or in municipal record. Inside, shelves held stacks of documents, maintenance logs, and equipment that seemed to anticipate events long before they happened. One room in particular contained a sealed control console connected to a network of valves, switches, and levers, all labeled with the same cryptic codes found in the ledger. Engineers examined the setup, realizing that the plant's machinery had been programmed to halt automatically to preserve itself and its occupants in a manner that defied conventional logic. It was a self-contained system, engineered with astonishing foresight and meticulous precision. The climactic revelation came in a storage chamber near the heart of the plant. Behind a reinforced steel door, the team found what appeared to be a living space, compact and austere, outfitted with sleeping quarters, basic supply ease, and logs meticulously documenting daily routines. It became clear that the workers had been placed in a controlled environment within the plant, their existence preserved, monitored, and recorded. The ledger had hinted at this, but seeing it firsthand was profoundly unsettling. The missing workers had not simply vanished, they had been hidden in plain sight, their lives suspended as part of an extraordinary, secretive protocol. The atmosphere was tense, a mixture of awe and unease permeating the air. Whispers traveled through the corridors, each realization heavier than the last. Questions that had lingered for decades, how, why, and by whose authority crowded every mind. Yet the physical evidence left no room for doubt. The plant had been intentionally sealed, the workers preserved, and the ledger had provided the key to understanding a mystery that had baffled generations. Samuel, Jonathan, and the team stood silently, absorbing the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The Ashford Coal Plant had revealed its truth, a revelation that was as meticulously constructed as it was profoundly shocking. Every sound, the creak of steel, the distant hum of untouched machinery, reminded them that they were witnessing not just a frozen past but a controllable experiment in time and preservation. The final truths emerged slowly, almost reverently, as the investigators cataloged each room, each artifact, each carefully maintained corner of the plant. The climax was not a moment of action but of realization, an understanding of human ingenuity and secrecy intertwined, leaving the team and the town waiting outside, awestruck by the calculated, haunting perfection of what had been hidden in plain sight for decades. The aftermath of the discovery at the Ashford Coal Plant rippled through the town and beyond, reshaping lives and perceptions that had been anchored for decades. News outlets arrived, capturing the surreal scene of perfectly preserved machinery, personal items frozen in time, and rooms that seemed both functional and abandoned. Families of the missing workers, including Mary Caldwell and Jonathan Rivers, were finally able to step inside the plant, their emotions a turbulent Roman 9 of relief, disbelief, and grief. They encountered Henry's meticulously arranged tools, Maggie's notebooks, and Samuel's careful records, each item a tangible proof of life and absence. Entwined. The reality that their loved ones had been intentionally preserved rather than lost brought both solace and a haunting question: why had this been done, and by whom? Historians and engineers worked tirelessly to catalog and understand the plant's inner mechanisms. They discovered that the shutdown had not been a failure or an accident but a deliberate containment protocol, an extraordinary feat of engineering and forethought. Machines had been programmed to maintain themselves, and certain chambers had been designed to sustain human life in isolation. Scholars speculated about the intent behind such measures, debating whether it had been an experiment in industrial preservation, an emergency conting inside, or part of a larger, now forgotten governmental or corporate project. Each theory carried its own weight, but none could fully capture the human and emotional complexity of what had occurred. For the community, the revelation was transformative. The town of Ashford, once haunted by fear and speculation, now faced a mix of pride and unease. They had witnessed an event that defied logic, experienced the revelation of a hidden truth, and come face to face with the meticulous ingenuity that had preserved lives for decades. Local businesses that had suffered from the plant's closure saw renewed interest, and historians from around the country arrived to study the unprecedented phenomenon. Yet amid the attention and scholarly debate, the human element remained central. The workers themselves, preserved not merely as subjects of curiosity, but as individuals whose absence had shaped families, friendships, and a community. Psychologically, the impact on the families was profound. Mary Caldwell spent long hours in the control room, tracing the paths Henry had once walked, touching the tools he had handled, and reading the notes he had left behind. Jonathan Rivers lingered over Maggie's notebooks, deciphering her observations, piecing together her thoughts and fears, and feeling a bittersweet connection that spanned decades. Samuel Dyer, who had first discovered the ledger, became a local historian of sorts, guiding researchers and families through the labyrinthine corridors, bridging past and present. The plant, once a source of fear and mystery, now became a repository of stories, memories, and profound human endurance. The media coverage framed the discovery as both miraculous and chilling. Headlines proclaimed the plant frozen in time and decades of mystery solved, yet the narrative was more complex than simple resolution. Experts noted the ethical, social, and emotional implications of preserving human life in isolation without informed consent, sparking debates that tended far beyond Ashford. Documentaries were proposed, books written, and interviews conducted, each attempt to capture the enormity of the event falling just short of the live experience of those who had endured the uncertainty and absence for so many years. Despite the clarity the ledger and the preserved chambers provided, the discovery left an enduring tension between understanding and wonder. The town could now explain the mechanisms, identify the people, and witness the objects that had been meticulously maintained, but the motivations in the entire operation remained partially obscured. What had driven such precise foresight? What unseen hands had orchestrated the preservation of life within the plant? The questions that lingered did not diminish the triumph of discovery. Rather, they added a layer of complexity, reminding the community that some truths, no matter how revealed, retain their power to astonish, to challenge, and to stir the imagination. In the end, the Ashford Coal Plant's unveiling became a story of human ingenuity, endurance, and the capacity for secrecy. It transformed despair into revelation, absence into presence, and silence into a living testimony of time suspended. The workers, once lost to the mysteries of the plant, had returned in a sense, not as fully restored participants in life, but as living echoes of a past that demanded recognition, respect, and reflection. The town, the families, and even the wider world had been forever altered by what had been hidden in plain sight for decades, proving that some mysteries, when finally revealed, carry the weight not only of truth but of the human spirit itself. Even after the Ashford Coal Plant had been opened and its secrets documented, a lingering sense of mystery refused to dissipate. Scholars, engineers, and historians had pieced together the mechanisms, the protocols, and the preserved chambers, yet the human motivations behind the entire operation remained elusive. Why had someone or some group decided that the lives of Henry Caldwell, Maggie Rivers, Samuel Dyer, and the others should be preserved in stasis for decades? Was it an act of foresight, an experiment in human endurance, or a secret contingency plan that history had almost forgotten? These questions hovered like shadows over the town, challenging the very nature of understanding and control. Families of the missing workers, now reunited in a way that was more symbolic than physical, struggled to reconcile relief with unease. Mary Caldwell, standing once again beside Henry's meticulously arranged tools, could feel his presence in the careful placement of each item, yet she also sensed a silent question left unanswered. Jonathan Rivers pored over Maggie's notebooks one last time, tracing her thoughts and remarks, understanding more fully the remarkable patience and intellect she must have carried through the unknown decades. Samuel Dyer, the accidental discoverer of the ledger, continued to guide visitors through the plant, each tour punctuated with awe, wonder, and the unspoken realization that some mysteries are as much about human imagination as they are about concrete facts. The town itself adapted to a new reality. Ashford became a center of study, curiosity, and cautious reverence. Scholars debated the ethical, mechanical, and psychological dimensions of the preservation. Local residents found themselves revisiting memories, reflecting on a time when fear had dominated hope, and recognizing the resilience of their community in the face of inexplicable events. The plant, once a sealed symbol of absence, now stood as a monument to human ingenuity, human curiosity, and the strange intersection of technology and life. Yet even with the documentation and public understanding, the emotional resonance of the decades-long disappearance persisted. The silence that had once weighed upon the town had been lifted, but it had left behind questions that no ledger, blueprint, or artifact could fully answer. Visitors entering the plant for the first time were struck not only by the technical precision, but by the palpable human presence frozen in place. Beds neatly made, personal effects undisturbed, machines perfectly aligned, all suggested a world paused yet carefully curated. Each corridor whispered the stories of those who had lived within its walls, echoing both ordinary routines and extraordinary circumstances. In that stillness, observers felt a profound connection to lives stretched across time, a reminder that even in the absence of motion, human experience could be preserved, studied, and contemplated. Yet the most unsettling realization for many was that while the plant had revealed its mechanics, it had not fully revealed its intentions. The decision-makers, the precise rationale for sealing the workers, and the ethical dimensions remained partially obscured, leaving a moral and psychological puzzle layered atop the technical marvel. Historians could hypothesize, engineers could demonstrate how the system functioned, but the human heart that had orchestrated the preservation remained hidden, a ghostly presence as persistent as the decades-long silence that preceded discovery. In the quiet moments after the plant had been cataloged and documented, Mary Caldwell stood alone in the control room, her hand brushing over Henry's worn gloves. She reflected on the decades of uncertainty, the sleepless nights, and the endless questions. The relief of discovery was mingled with a haunting awareness. Even with all the answers, some truths lingered just beyond reach, teasing the mind and stirring the imagination. Jonathan Rivers, watching sunlight fall across Maggie's notebook, felt a similar reverence for the unknown, an acknowledgement that the plant's story extended beyond facts into the realm of human wonder and enduring mystery. The Ashford Coal Plant, once a silent enigma, had become a bridge between past and present, absence and presence, fear and understanding. It reminded the town, the families, and the world that some mysteries are not merely to be solved but to be experienced, reflected upon, and remembered. As the sun set over the weathered gates, casting long shadows across the preserved machinery, one thought persisted: the plant had given back its sector. Yet it had left behind the haunting realization that the human heart, the mind that devised such a plan, and the motives behind it may never fully be known. And in that realization, a question remained, echoing softly through the corridors of Ashford: when life is preserved beyond its time, do we ever truly understand the choices that made it possible? The story of the Ashford Coal Plant leaves us with more than answers. It leaves us with a reflection on human ingenuity, resilience, and the mysteries that quietly shape our lives. For decades, a sealed building held the truth of those who disappeared, their lives preserved in a suspended moment, untouched by time. Families endured uncertainty, communities whispered legends, and generations grew up haunted by absence. Yet when the truth finally emerged, it was both astonishing and profoundly human. Lives carefully documented, machinery perfectly preserved, and a secret deliberately maintained, waiting for someone to uncover it. In witnessing this extraordinary revelation, we are reminded that the world holds layers of reality that often escape immediate understanding. Some truths demand patience, curiosity, and courage to uncover. The Ashford Coal Plant challenges us to question, to explore, and to honor the unseen efforts that shape history and preserve lives in ways we may never fully comprehend. It is a story that blends human emotion with technical precision, mystery with revelation, and absence with presence, leaving an indelible mark on all who hear it. If this story has stirred your curiosity, made you question the unknown, or inspired a sense of wonder, don't let it end here. Share your thoughts, theories, or reflections in the comments below. Subscribe to follow along as we uncover more hidden truths, forgotten mysteries, and astonishing discoveries from across the world. Every story holds a secret, and every secret deserves to be told. Join us as we explore the mysteries that time almost forgot.